Good afternoon. My name's Nathaniel. I'm director of the cultural charity that looks after the house and brings you this festival. So we're joined for this event by the author of a book called Muslims Don't Matter and a book called The Next Crisis. Yes, I'm told this is an event about optimism. We've heard lots from the stage over the last week about war, division, inequality, the erosion of rights. But as the home of the Bloom Street Group, we're keen not just to wallow or criticise, but also to be a space which offers solutions. And for this festival to be where our greatest minds come together, as John Maynard Keynes and his friends did a century ago, to imagine society differently. I'm delighted to welcome some of those great minds to the stage today. At a time of increasing division and conflict around the world, we'll be hearing today from two people who seek to find compromise, common ground, and shared values, who seek to find what unites, not divides us. So please join me in welcoming to Charleston Baroness Warsi, Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister and a Conservative peer. Political commentator, Oxford Professor of Geography, and advisor to the Office for National Statistics, Danny Dorling. And finally, our chair, writer and academic philosopher, Arianne Shahvisi.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Charleston Festival organisers for having us. And thank you to Danny and Sayeeda for doing this event. I'm delighted to be joined by a prominent Muslim public figure, a prominent socialist. And I find myself sort of in the middle of these two positions as a socialist raised in a Muslim household. And so we're sort of on a continuum in some sense. And I hope we can kind of, navigate between those things as we have this conversation. So I've read both books in depth. I've enjoyed them greatly. I would strongly recommend the books that have just been released by both authors. They're grounded in kind of real-world statistics and real-world case studies, and they're both kind of bold and brave and intent, importantly, and this will be important to our discussion today, on challenging orthodoxies. As we've just heard, they're both ultimately positive books, despite their inevitably upsetting subject matter. So maybe it's best, though, if I start, rather than attempting to summarise them myself, by asking each of you to say something about why you wrote your latest book, what it was that led you to feel that there was a really necessary message here, because I feel that comes across very strongly in both books. But that's always the standard opening question, isn't it, in these festivals, right? That you ask, why did you write the book? So I want to throw in a slight twist on that, because both of you in your books write about your parents, and I know that you both also have children. And so I wonder if you could say something about how the message in your book and the urgency of your book relates both to your parents and also to your children. So looking forward to the future as well. Sayeeda, would you like to start us off?
Thank you very much, and thank you all of you. Good afternoon. Thank you for turning up. And what a great question. I think I wrote this book. The idea for it really was born in February last year, and it was in the middle of feeling hopeless, heartbroken, scared, in light of what was going on in the Middle East in the run-up to the general election, with the language that we were beginning to hear, with what was potentially happening or about to happen in the United States. And triggered by a personal conversation which related to our kids and their future, but looking back at where my family had come from. And it was a conversation about, I'm one of 5, and 3 of my siblings, the third one, had just told me that she was buying a place somewhere else, a sanctuary home, that she was planning an exit route, that she was putting in place a plan B, because she was concerned about, like my other siblings, about the place for Muslims in Britain in years to come. And this was happening amongst lots of friends and family. And I said to my husband, are we going to be like those very well-established integrated Jewish families of the 1930s who thought, oh, it can't possibly happen. And then it did. And are we going to be that family that's left behind because we can't see the writing on the wall when it's on the wall? And he said to me, well, if you think it's game over, then it's definitely game over. And I sat back and I thought about what that meant. And, looking at where I'd come from, 70 years, coming up to 70 years in country, the family's relationship with Britain, but also, hundreds of years of relationship with Britain before that in colonial India. The granddaughter of two men who'd served in the British Indian Army. We've just been commemorating VE Day, and my maternal grandfather served for 25 years in the Bombay Sappers and Miners Engineering Regiment. He served on the Burma front. I had a great uncle who was taken prisoner of war. My grandfather came here in the 50s, worked in the mills. Dad worked in the mills. I had the privilege of serving my country at the cabinet table, and my only born child is now back in uniform, serving this country.
Yeah.
And it was looking at that history and saying, surely this is not how it ends, where British Muslims start to feel that a country that they've defended and protected and built may not defend and protect them in the future. Yeah. And I think it was that. So I think in essence it's a heartbreak letter to my country.
Yeah, and it's and it is very beautifully written, but it is heartbreaking to read it and to kind of feel that with you, that fear and that insecurity. Thank you so much for that, Danny.
Yeah, the shocking thing reading your book is realising how many of the great and the good have said some bigoted thing once, because you document them all. Yeah. And it is utterly shocking. I'd forgotten I had my parents in, and I was trying to rack my brains about how they got in, because I try not to write about my family ever. The reason I had them in is that they live near Dolgelley in West Wales, and they live very near to the first village that was abandoned because of climate change. So there's a village on the coast, I won't name it, because it hasn't been helped by this, where the Welsh government said, we won't be able to protect you after 2050 because the sea's rising, and that's it. We'll try and look after the seawall till then, but you've had it. Now, if you imagine you live in that village, it's very different to people trying to get a property in another country so that they have somewhere to flee. But you live in that village, you've managed to get your retirement home in that village, and suddenly your property is worth zero because it's going to be abandoned. The effect's quite devastating. The interesting story there was that it's been quietly de-abandoned. Because although the sea is rising on average at 20 centimetres a century, the spit rises also. And in fact, the threats to this village are the same that they've always been, which is water flooding down from Cadair Idris above it, not the sea rising up. What I was trying to do in the book was to put some order and hierarchy into the things that we worry about. We all have worries. Most of our worries are personal, about people we love and our families and so on. If we give you a list of 18 things, which is what Ipsos Mori very kindly did in about 30 countries in the world for well over a couple of decades, every month, if we give you a list of 18 things and say which of these concern you the most, that produces an order which may surprise you. If you look at what people who are paid to come up with worries come up with, that's different again. If you count how many things harm and kill people, you get different orders. And what I was trying to do was to put them in some kind of order, because I've got sick of people saying we live in an age of polycrisis, where it's just one thing after another, and because for my whole adult life I've taught university students, and this is making them more and more and more depressed. They really think, many of them, there's only 12 years left to save the planet. There's no chance that they're ever going to have a stable home because inequality is rising. We're doomed, the far right are rising everywhere, and so on. And it's only when you start counting these things that you work out that there's actually a lot of good news in the world. Life is getting better for most people in most places, most of the time. inequality is falling in more countries than it's rising. Social scientists don't feel, we want to look at the next thing which is worse. And on crises, when we used to have a crisis every year, in those centuries where we had wars and pandemics and epidemics all the time, we didn't talk about crisis, because it's normal. There was a little rise in talking about crisis just before the Second World War, but the big rise was the 60s, Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the 70s was worse, the 80s was worse, the 90s was worse, and we talk about it more and more and more. The pandemic, even bigger. Trump, even bigger. Now, it has to end at some point. And I say several things that may be controversial in the book, which I believe, and one thing I say is I think we only got into this state of constantly talking about crises when enough of us in the world had lives which are so stable, when war hadn't happened for a couple of decades, when we had economic security, when we had pensions and other things. Why did it rise in the 60s and 70s and 80s as such a term? It's because we think stability is normal, which would be lovely and it should be. But all of these crises, the word becomes devalued. And you need to, I think, concentrate on what actually matters most to most people, what harms people, and fears, like fears of having to leave a country, which is so much more important than other fears, if you imagine it. And it's very hard to step into other people's shoes and imagine their fears rather than, let's do this first, stereotyping. Your house is going to be worth £200,000 less in a couple of years' time. That might secretly be the worst thing that you could be worrying about, but it isn't actually that bad a thing. If you happen to own a house, you're doing very, very well. If it drops in value by 200 grand, honestly, you're still doing much better than the vast majority of people in the UK, let alone the world. So it's ordering things, trying to order it into some kind of rational system.
Yeah, well, this is fascinating for me, Danny, because one of the things that I talk about is the state of racism and bigotry when I was growing up. And it was brutal, it was immediate, and it was usually a smack in the face. And, it's a terrible term, but it was a term that we all grew up with, and it was called packy bashing. And so you were, certain times of the year, you knew there would be a fight, you'd have to run very fast from school, but there would effectively be physical violence. And in many ways, and before that, my parents and my grandparents experienced physical violence on the streets, kind of the daily aggressions of what it was like to live in Britain in the 50s and 60s. And certainly during the 80s and 90s, we thought we'd kind of worked beyond that, and we were coming to a stage where Britain was much more comfortable with its diversity, and we were much more comfortable about being an intrinsic part of Britain, as being a person of colour, either a black person or a brown person. But interestingly, things changed thereafter. September the 11th was obviously a major moment. 7/7 was a major moment. Various other moments. But people like me stopped being Asian and British or black British or whatever you wanted to define us as, and we became Muslim British. And all of those kind of arguments and rows about being a part of British society started all over again. And a term that I use now, and it's quite a provocative term to use, and I hope people aren't offended by it, but having been a social mobility success story, coming from a working class background, having inhabited the corridors of power, and seen the kind of respectable racism which you see in editorial newsrooms, in think tanks, in the corridors of power, I kind of feel like, and this is, is this just a worry or is this real, is the question I'm asking you, because I feel that, although it's not immediate, is far more pernicious and dangerous, because little Johnny who smacked you in the face had immediate power because, he smacked you in the face, but actually probably was living the same difficult working class challenges that you were living in the communities that we were living in. But when this starts becoming the editor of the Daily Telegraph, or it becomes the head of some think tank, it then these are people who might not smack you in the face, but actually have got so much power that they will impact the course of your life and the course of your generations to come. So one of the terms, like I said, a provocative term that I use is, smack me in the face and call me a packy, I can live with that. What I can't live with is this respectable rubbish that I see at the heart of power, where policy making is deliberately skewed into a way where a whole community is demonised.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's very interesting. It's really hard to disassociate your own experience from what you most care about. I have a map of everybody who's died in war as counted by the very nice Swedish folk since 1989. This is detailed counts of everybody who dies in war in a warlike situation. And other than Rwanda, the map is dominated by Muslim countries. The weapons that would have killed most people would have been made by Christian countries. Right? I look at that map and I think, what, and this is by the editorials, what does it take for the world not to see what we're actually sanctioning? You're kinder than me, I think. So, over talking, I do talk partly about part of my family. One thing it's useful to know is I grew up in a mixed-race family. So 2 of my brothers are black and one's white, and this is 1970s. And Pakistani kids got stabbed every summer by then. And we knew. My mum wouldn't let my 15-year-old brother go to London without me, but that was because of the police. But that was back then. The changes have got dramatically better. You can measure in all kinds of ways. Where it happened most recently for me was that there was a little instance on my road, which is a very posh road, but Thames Valley Police were being called, and it was that armed response unit. And we've only got one, I think, in Thames Valley. And I'm out being interested, and I reckon about a 26-year-old female black WPC came up to me and said, "Sir, I think you need to go indoors." And a little smile on my face, because the police used to beat you up. So I'm less happy about what happened in the 70s and the skinheads and the National Front. But this pernicious slice that there is, we need to call it out. We don't because of politeness. It comes out in all kinds of ways of bigotry. I've been at dinner tables in Oxford colleges where they've wanted to talk about the lower orders having genes that aren't as good as other people. It certainly comes out in various forms of racism, sly little comments, or let's not talk about that. And it ends up ultimately with that global map of war and who's it okay to kill and who isn't it okay to kill. And if we didn't have an acceptance of racism, I don't think we would have that as bad as it is. We certainly wouldn't be happy about weapons companies in this country making weapons that are primarily being used to kill people whose skin is not white. And we should talk about it much more clearly like that.
Yeah, and I think that connection between them is really important, right? Understanding that kind of elite racism, if you want to call it that, is feeding the kind of, everyday in the street sort of racism as well, and the two are intimately connected, and then connected then again with, kind of military incursions abroad as well.
But to go back to the change around September 11th, my littlest brother is a mix of Caribbean, white, and a little bit of Chinese. And what that means, shortly after 2011, and he grew a beard, what that means is people assume he's Pakistani. So the difference in how he was behaved, he's never been a Muslim, he's not from Asia at all, apart from that little bit of Chinese, and that was in the Caribbean anyway. The difference after that year is in how he's treated. This thing which had been getting better suddenly turns round and begins to get worse. Now he's gone a bit bald, it's kind of looks older, it's easier, but it's all about looks. If he wanted space on a tube train, all he had to do was take a rucksack. And I'm not. Yeah. And simply based, or, and this is modern day, if he walks down a leafy, sandal-wearing, Guardian-reading street in Oxford on his own, people cross the road. If he walks with his wife who's white, they don't. Right? It's subconscious. These are people who hate to know they did this. But it is pernicious and all the time. And that's just what I see, which is from my eyes, and I don't have to experience this at all, and what we can measure. So you can see racism in the United States simply by measuring life expectancy and working out to what extent is that affected by the racism, who gets evicted, who's in prisons, why there is a prison industrial complex in the USA that's making money, that it's allowed to do it because there aren't that many white people in US prisons.
It's really interesting because when I describe what I mean by Islamophobia in the book, which is anti-Muslim racism, what I explain is that it's got absolutely nothing to do with religiosity. And many of the anti-Muslim attacks are not even against Muslims, they're against Sikhs or they're against people like you've just described, your members of your family. Because the connection between praying and believing and racism is simply not there when it comes down to Muslim racism. It is a set of tropes about a community. Men are misogynistic, men are sexually predatory, women are don't have agency, or they're exotic belly dancers. These kind of tropes are placed upon the community, and then based upon, or they're terrorists, they're extremists, and then based upon that is the reaction that they get from people, rather than the kind of individual experience of what that person is like.
Yeah.
If I may jump in on that, because I think we need to talk about immigration, probably, right? That's and I want us to think a little bit about Keir Starmer's comments a couple of weeks ago now, his Island of Strangers speech. And he said in that speech, when people come to our country, they should also commit to integration. Now, to me, integration is a kind of deeply troubling idea, and we can discuss this in just a moment. You know, we all kind of collectively produce a community, and so integration necessarily means that everybody has to move a little bit to accommodate everybody else. That's what it means to be in a society with one another, rather than the onus being on a particular group, in this case, Muslims. But I also want to point out, as a kind of connected point, and I'd already written this question before I came across Andy Beckett's article in The Guardian today, which some of you may have seen, where he argues that wealthy people are the least integrated part of our society, right? So it's not immigrants who are the least integrated, but rather the kind of very wealthy elite who their children don't go to the same schools that everybody else's children go to, they don't shop in the same place, they're not really living the same lives as other people. So I wondered to what extent each of you would agree with that, and whether we could talk about integration, both in terms of the way in which Keir Starmer meant it, on the one hand, and then also thinking more about other groups that might not be so well integrated. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating for me, because if we go back to the early Cameron years, before we got into government, I always say Cameron 2007, 8, 9, some of the speeches that he was talking about, which amongst others we were talking about integration. And what we did with David at that time was that we sent him off to Birmingham. He went to live with a Muslim family for a couple of days, actually staying in their house, spending time with the extended family. He went and took their kids to school. And when he came back, I remember the conversation that I had with him, and he said it was just fascinating, Sayeeda. He said people were in and out of the house all day, the family all ate together, there was intergenerational living, everybody took responsibility for everybody, there was just this real sense of community. And off the back of that, he did this speech, which amongst other things, he talked about how integration was a two-way street, and that how there were things that we could learn from each other, and there was much that he felt Britain had forgotten, but in many ways he saw in this home, in this Birmingham home of this Muslim family. And the second thing that I kind of talk about in the final chapter of the book is, I say that the very qualities that we so admired in Her Late Majesty, her sense of family, her sense of duty, the stiff upper lip, the ability to dress in a really modest way, her lovely headscarves, all the wonderful things that we enjoyed in Her Late Majesty are so obviously seen within Muslim women. and yet we see them as such a negative trait amongst them. I mean, wow, they don't shout and scream, they kind of want to deal with this in a much more kind of measured way, they believe in family, they think the importance of keeping family together, that it's not just about the individual, it's about the whole, that actually it's about dressing in a certain way. And I remember when my girls went to university, and often when they'd get ready to go out, I'd look at them and go, really? And I'd say, look, I'm not going to be there with you when you go out on a night out. You're going to be able to wear what you want. Mum is not going to be stood at the door going, really? And I said, so all I would say to you is when you look in the mirror when you're ready, if you see Kate Middleton, tick. If you see Kim Kardashian, you got it wrong. And so, in a lot of ways, I kind of think the qualities that we love about the people that we admire are the qualities that we actually then see as negative traits amongst a community that we feel that we want to demonize. So I think, what does integration look like? What are the values that we're talking about? Because ultimately, I think integration is about, values. And so often, many of the values that I see, if you were an alien right now and you dropped in on Wakefield, which is where I'm from in Yorkshire, you came to Wakefield on a Friday night, I'm not sure an alien would be able to work out what the values of Britain are right now. Yeah. And be able to say, oh, that's what I'm joining.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's it, focusing on the values rather than the group that may be, expressing those values. My dad's actually been in hospital for the last couple of months, and it's been very obvious to me, being in that hospital space, that the group, the big families that come and visit and stay, I've been there as much as I can at his bedside, are families of colour, right? And that was very obvious. Apart from, there was this big working class family white working class family from Canning Town, who came along and, they were by the bed of their granddad the whole time as well. And it just reminded me, having grown up in a very white working class place and now inhabiting a more middle class space, that actually that value, the value of family that's so important in the culture I come from, Kurdish Iranian culture, is so important in working class families as well. And the place where I felt that it's sort of a smaller and less influential thing is in the lives of middle-class people who perhaps have more resources to be a bit more isolated and don't need that sense of family as much. Talking about values and how they cross these sectors of society, I think, is really, really important here. Danny, I wondered whether, on the immigration points, going back to Keir Starmer's comments there, you go to some trouble within the book to demonstrate we need immigration, right? We desperately need immigration. Can you explain that for us? In sort of simple terms, because there's so much in the book and so much data that goes with it, but can you give us a kind of quick preview of that?
Very quick. Well, we've had immigration for a very long time. We have since at least 1905. We were quite good before 1905, but at least since, we let in Karl Marx, because we were so super confident. We really were quite open, and we were right. There was no revolution here. 1905 is when we really began to start demonising immigrants. It was Jewish immigrants. It's useful politically to have a group who you say are the enemy, so you can stop people worrying about their biggest concerns. You can watch it going through, from the Irish to Black Caribbean to Pakistani. We even managed to be racist about people with whiter skins than us, which was during the Brexit debate. People were actually attacked. And the last 20 years is Muslim. And you've got to end this at some point. I had a report from Wakefield last Friday. This is... because Wakefield on a Friday night is a thing to be seen, as is Newcastle, Liverpool. There are others available, Nottingham. But the sad thing I had confirmed to me, it's never been quieter than last Friday. Same with Liverpool, same as Newcastle, and Saturday. Because the discretionary money is drinking money. And if you had the cost of living crisis for 3 years, you don't have enough money to do that. But back to integration, we can measure in every census the degree of segregation of different groups. Since 1991, since we first asked ethnicity, it goes down every time. There is no white flight. The only group which is really segregated are the extremely rich, who are very and increasingly frightened over where they go. There are no ghettos. The only way you can get a ghetto out of a census is by not cutting it like this, horizontally, but cutting it this way, vertically. And if you draw a line across England at the 5th storey, the majority of children who live above the 5th storey in this country are not white. And the census tells us that the majority of children, 2001, mostly in London, some in Birmingham, aren't white, which matters because of Grenfell, of course. Children weren't supposed to be put high up in tower blocks because the lift stopped working. But we can measure all of these things. I was really pleased to know that David had been taken there. Because if you imagine, and none of this is anybody's fault when they're children, right? But imagine you grow up in a stockbroking family. You're sent fairly early on to that boarding school. You're in that closeted school with just boys, so you're segregated from girls. And then you turn up at Brasenose, so you only know the little colleges in the middle, not even the colleges on the edge of the middle of Oxford. You get halfway down the Cowley Road to the High-Low Club, and people think you're very cool. And then you're into Carlton TV in London, and your social world, your wife goes to the same school as Kate Middleton. It's everybody knows everybody else, and they don't know everybody who matters, which is 99% of people, and it's not their fault. Whereas in the past, we were a much more mixed country by the 50s and 60s. At the point when the judge said, "Is this a book you would like your wife or servants to read?" Right? That's when you knew you were beginning to win. We had much more mixed marriages between social classes. Racism reduces, but as the wealth and the income inequality has increased, the fear that's driving people into areas where the majority are using private healthcare, private education, and they're paying for their children not to meet other people. And that is scary, and we have the highest inequality of all of Europe, which means we don't know each other. Hopefully that changes, and we get back to that position where the famous thing about the judge quoting that was, of course, none of the jurors had a servant anymore because there were no servants. If you go back to when London was most polarised in the 1880s, 1890s, some of you will know the Charles Booth maps, where the black areas are called vicious semi-criminal poor, the purple not quite so poor, and the yellow areas on those maps are called the homes of the servant-keeping classes. And the only way we got rid of the worst of the rookeries and the worst areas was by also getting rid of the idea that it's okay to have servants, right? And then you begin to get more and more mixing. Without mixing, you won't understand. The tragedy is that it's useful for politicians like Starmer and his advisors. They've been told by their focus groups that this is going to somehow press a button that will help them in their fight against reform. It won't. They're really, really sadly misguided on this. I think Starmer came out of it when he did because his back's up against the wall. He may have many, many hundreds of MPs, but those local elections have shown in what direction things are going, and he's actually scared of what his members of parliament might do, because they might not want, in the majority, to lose their jobs at the next election, and so he's trying to show he's the big man. He can outpace Kemi and Nigel, and it never works. He should look at Australia at the election, he should look at Canada, he should look at Poland, he should look at Modi beginning to do worse in elections in India, and realise you don't win as a Labour Party by being more racist than reform. We're just clear.
Yeah, thank you. No, absolutely. I could not agree more with that. And I want to just jump in on that point that you made about we don't know each other anymore, right? And I said at the beginning, politically I'm a socialist, and I think it helps to say that at the beginning, because I think declaring these things means that we have a more honest and transparent conversation, right? If we declare where we stand politically.
Politically, I'm a conservative.
Well,
and if this is a therapy session.
my question actually relates to this, Sayeeda, because you are the first conservative I have had an extended, direct conversation with in a very long time. And I expect, and I say extended and direct, because obviously we all have these brief, indirect sort of contacts with people online, right, which are not especially productive. And it's very sad that I can say that, and I think that's probably true of most people in the room, that we aren't having regular civil political conversations with people who do not share our views, right? And that's not necessarily a question of trying to convince one another, but trying to understand better the whole scope of the political spectrum, and also recognising that part of our job is to try to change people's minds where we can on single issues, if not on the whole thing, if not on every single political position we might take. So,
are you convinced then?
Am I convinced? I'm very convinced by your book. Absolutely.
Can I whip out Tory party membership for?
But you do. There is a section in your book where you sort of say, it's not quite, but my eyes opened up to what the Tory party was like. You can. That's not your exact words.
So interestingly for me, I have quite a toxic relationship with the current Conservative Party. And I do feel like I'm in a toxic relationship, because on the one hand, I have been a Conservative for nearly 30 years, and on the other hand, I have spent the last 10 years trying to convince the Conservative Party and the colleagues in it to stop being so divisive and inflammatory in the language that they use and the way in which they do their politics. But I also keep reminding people that the cabinet table that I sat around had Ken Clarke to one side and Dominic Grieve at the other, and David Willits in between, and Justine Greening and William Hague. And that concept of kind of one nation conservatism, which I had been an instinctive part of in those kind of years, has shifted, and we've seen that in the way in which the Labour Party has shifted to the right, and there's been a general kind of movement. But I do think, going back to that, I think the question that you raised is, how do we have good, solid, open, transparent relationships? One of the things that I do when I've been taking this book around the country is to start by saying nothing is off the table.
Yes.
There are no no-go areas. There is no question you're going to ask me which is going to offend me, as long as what we're doing is asking questions and answering questions in the interests of learning. Mm-hmm. And so when people say to me, the problem that we have with Muslims and Islam is that you can't talk about them. And I'm like, you talk about them every day. I can't open up a newspaper without everybody talking about them. Yeah. But what we often don't find is we're not having a two-way conversation. It's a headline about them, the Muslims, without any kind of context to it. And that's why I think, when I start the book, because I've had years and years of trying to unpick these conversations, so many of them rooted in such bigotry. I mean, I don't often watch GB News, but there was this clip that somebody sent through to me where we had, I've forgotten his name now, a historian, kind of quite disgraced actually, he still appears on there. It'll come to me at some point.
Don't get the name wrong.
And he basically, it will. Anyway, it'll come to me. Menopause, menopause.
Guess a bigot.
It will come to me. And he basically turned around and he said, well, let's not talk, let's talk about the big elephant in the room. The problem we have in this country is Islam and misogyny, and that's because they have a ruling in their religion, which means their women have to walk behind their men. And I'm sat there going, David Starkey, right? Yeah. And I'm sat there going, I'm thinking, wow, how intelligent do you have to be that thick? and to kind of suggest that this is somehow a ruling in the kind of, and I think that level of, which is why I think, the book starts with me saying, I'm done. I'm done with explaining and justifying and caveating and being responsible for any one of the 2 billion people around the world who might happen to be born into the same religion that I was born into, and trying to explain every verse of a 7th century text in a way that we don't for any other kind of communities. So, I completely agree. We have to find spaces to have good conversations, and it's one of the reasons why in the depth of the war in Gaza, when so many of us were feeling so completely kind of traumatized by what we were seeing on our screens in so many different communities, that David Baddiel and I decided that we were going to start a podcast, that we were actually going to get around the table and start this podcast called The Muslim and a Jew Go There. And we were going to go there and have the conversations that needed to be had, and we were going to have them together. And even when we disagreed, we were going to be comfortable with sitting with disagreement.
Yeah. No, and I think that's just incredibly important. And I think that for ordinary people, there are very few spaces for this to happen, for that learning to actually take place without someone kind of shouting at you, without it descending into something unproductive. I'm keeping an eye on the time here and realising that we don't have a lot left before I open up for questions from the audience. So what I'd like to ask about, I mean, both of your books close on a very positive note, despite being sort of quite dispiriting all the way through, right? I mean, these are not, you know, I mean, there are moments of hope throughout yours, arguably, Danny, but, you know, for the most part, you're painting a fairly bleak picture of the world, and I'm not saying that's unrealistic, it feels very accurate to me. It's just you're putting statistics and case studies where I have suspicions.
Yeah.
And yet you both finish on this positive note, and you both kind of, the positivity from both of you actually relates to the response to the racist riots last year. You both have a slight reference to that. So I wondered whether you could say something, with the sort of minute and a half we have left, if you could both say something that gives us reason for optimism, given all the things that you write about. Danny, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, they were scary. And it's interesting how fast we forget. We came very close to a pogrom, people being burnt to death. We could have treated it in a different way. There was just attempted murder. And it was orchestrated. When you look at the pattern, you do not get purely over the north. I drew the north-south divide line. Right? It's one of the things I did a long time ago. Took ages. Somebody took that line, they took the innocent deprivation, and then they seeded social media. Because it's too good to fit over where those riots began, and bust people in. My favourite thing on those riots was when they came to Blackpool and hadn't realised there's a celebratory punk festival of fairly old punks now, but 10,000 of them, which meant that it didn't happen in Blackpool because punks don't like racists. Optimism. I end the book. I'm a Labour Party member, but and I should say, by the way, to be fair on racism, I have 9 black friends in the Labour Party. 8 of them have been expelled. Not for any good reason, just from the purges. It's a white party now, where I live in Oxford. So it's not good. But the positive, and you can always find bad things. The positive thing I end on is 10 slightly revolutionary statements made around about just before 1914. These were the commandments of the Socialist Sunday School movement, which you may never have heard of. It still is one in Glasgow. You can take your kids to the Socialist Sunday School. The 10 things that they were asking for then are things we mostly have, or the vast majority of people believe in. And you can take a several century history of social progress. We do tend to get there. We do tend to avert the worst crises, otherwise there wouldn't be many of us left. We do tend to worry endlessly about things that we forget about 10 years later, because they aren't. It was killer bees, it may be AI next. There's the one that we forget that we actually worried so much about it once we're used to it. But in general, on average, things get better most of the time. If you give people a lot of time, they'll concentrate on how everything is terrible, and that's partly why things get better, but it can get too depressing.
Thanks, Sally.
So 29 different incidents in 27 different towns and cities were there riots. I think people sometimes forget that hundreds and hundreds of people arrested off the back of it, and the kind of descriptions, and I talk about it in the final chapter. And a moment where literally phone calls were flying across family and friends, and people were being advised not to go out for the first time. We were basically saying, don't go to work, try to take time off, try and work from home, don't go out and socialise. Everything was cancelled. And it was fed from the top. And this is what I keep saying in this book. What we are witnessing, the division, is not Britain deciding it suddenly wants to be divisive. It is quite deliberate from the top, where people in positions of power, people with huge platforms in social media, in the newspapers, in editorial rooms, in think tanks, in political foreign ex-home secretaries, people stood at the dispatch box putting out this drip, drip, drip divisive language, poisoning the public discourse. And then we see the kind of response from the bottom up is green lighting really this behaviour. And what we saw in response, and this is where I think the hope is, the street came out and said no. Yeah. It's when people came out and took back their streets. It's when the builder in Southport went out the next day and didn't go to work but said, I'm going to rebuild the mosque wall, which had been broken the day before. It was when ordinary people, actually people who went to protest outside the Liverpool mosque, then decided they would go in and have a cup of tea and a samosa, and then the weekend after they all went on a big old boys jolly to Wales, Jolly Boys Network, holiday to Wales. And I just kind of think there was something. There was this great poster I saw during that time of a bunch of older women with a poster saying "Nans against Nazis." Yeah. I just think it's when ordinary people said, "You will not do this in my name. These are my neighbours. These are people I've grown up with. These are people that I will not accept." And the fact that we had powerful people like Elon Musk whipping this up on one of the most powerful social network platforms from across the pond, effectively encouraging civil war. Yeah. So where does the hope come? The hope comes because in the end we all fight back and we realise that's not what we want. The hope comes when we build communities. It's the biggest message in my book. Build communities. Start from the bottom up and work out, know the areas that you live in. From a Muslim perspective, there's a very clear Islamic teaching. We've got a project now which we've started called Project 2040. It's looking at kids who are going to be kind of 16 to 18 in 2040. And we're working with them now. How do you train them to be the next generation of community builders based upon the Islamic teaching that if there's a teaching which basically says that if 40 to your left and 40 to your right of where you live have not eaten, then you don't have the right to eat that night. So it's about you being responsible. You can either sit there and say, woe be me, this is really tough, and this book does say a lot of that, but you can you can step out and say, I am responsible for building community. And at a time when this country is getting older, when we get to 2050, we think we worry about migrants now. We will be worried at 2050. We'll be going around the world with a begging bowl, asking migrants to come to this country by that point because of the situation that we will be in. And in 2050, actually one of the most youngest, vibrant, growing communities is the British Muslim community. Over half of them are under the age of 25, I think. Increasingly finding it difficult to get jobs, so setting up the businesses, going into the kind of what we would call the apprenticeship professions. Arts, culture, the vibrancy in that community is phenomenal out of this kind of having the spotlight on them. And as I say, in the book, to repurpose a phrase for better use, British Muslims have the potential to make Britain great again.
Thank you very much, and I love that 40 to the left and 40 to the right. I mean, it's just an amazing kind of summary of what I feel we all instinctively feel we need to do, regardless of the kind of background or faith or, precise demographic that we're in. That brings us to the end of the conversation, but I want to now open up the floor to questions. I think there are roving mics. Yes, there are. Could we start over here, please? Thank you.
Just wondered what both of you thought of the weaponisation of anti-Semitism, first against Corbyn and now in the US.
Who wants to start?
It's your party.
It's my party, yeah. The amazing thing is I'm still in it. But I am very, very careful what I say. I hope I'm not an anti-Semite. The problem is, of course, the minute somebody says I am, and that's all you've got to do, because it's not actually about what people say or how they behave now. I think it's quite remarkable what happened, looking back. and how it happened. I think there was an enormous fear once the 2017... There was none of this before 2017. The 2017 general election was the biggest swing per year between Labour Conservatives ever. 4 times faster than the one that got you to 1945. Right? We don't quite know why. Those momentum kids were effective. There was hope Theresa was particularly boring. But to deny Theresa May that majority in 2017 was a shock. I think there are quite a lot of people at the top. I think you have who thought this is a serious threat to Britain. You know, his chance of winning was low, Corbyn. But he doesn't believe in our nuclear deterrent. This is, you know, really, really, really serious. And there were attempts to find many, many things to get him on. And it wasn't until they got to anti-Semitism that they could use something that stuck. And he didn't deal with that well. He should have sued the first people who claimed it and didn't. I think there's less of it now, in terms of simply calling somebody an anti-Semite to shut them up. But I can say that what is going on in Gaza, I think, is racism. And I think I could do that. I think it's war crimes. It'll almost certainly be found to be genocide when it's determined. Anybody who aids or abets a war crime or a genocide is also complicit in the crime. And this is going to, at some point, come to the courts internationally. And that is the situation we are currently in. But it's tricky. It's really tricky, despite the fact that here we're talking about people's feelings, whereas much else that I worry about is actually talking about people being physically hurt, killed in some cases, or slaughtered. Yeah.
So I break this up into a number of different ways. I don't like the word anti-Semitism, I don't like the word Islamophobia. I call it anti-Jewish racism, I call it anti-Muslim racism. Because we have to be very clear what it is we're talking about. It is when we stereotype, we demonise, we marginalise, and we put tropes on a community, and we say all of you therefore have these characteristics. And if we do that to any community, that's racism. So anti-Jewish racism, anti-Muslim racism. Where these issues have been weaponised, and by the way, they were weaponised by my party as well, was over, and it started before Corbyn, by the way. So if you look at the early criticism that came of the Labour Party, it was when Ed Miliband was leader. There was a lot of criticism of him, and the criticism came because he moved the party to a position that they would recognise Palestine. And once that recognition policy was in place, there was even outrage, by the way, from British Jewish communities saying that they felt that Ed Miliband wasn't a proper Jew, wasn't really kind of part of the community, didn't hold the views that were mainstream. All of that stuff started well before Corbyn, by the way. And it was linked to what was happening in the Middle East. What happened with Corbyn, for me, there were 2 parts to this. One, and I say this with the greatest of respect, one of the biggest challenges about the Corbyn eras was just how incompetent Corbyn's office was and the people around him were. And when issues are raised, every organisation has people amongst it who have distasteful views. I am absolutely convinced there were people in the Labour Party who were anti-Semitic or were saying things which would be considered to be anti-Jewish racism. But they simply, it's not a question of whether your organisation has those people, it's whether you as an organisation do something about it when you become aware of those issues. And I just do not think that the office acted in the way that it should have done. But this is where the hypocrisy kicks in. At the time, so months before this all broke out, back in 2015, and I've got all of this is documented, some of it in the book, some of it, I have emails, letters that go back to 2015, where I started raising the issue of anti-Muslim racism within the Conservative Party. I had colleagues who were retweeting Tommy Robinson. I had colleagues who were promoting conspiracy theories about Muslim communities. I had colleagues who were hosting far-right extremists in Parliament. We had the most terrible, vile Islamophobic comments being made at association level, within the voluntary, all sorts of things were coming to light. And these things were all fed into the party. And each time it was basically brushed under the carpet. And when the Conservative Party started raising the issue of anti-Jewish racism within the Labour Party, the question I asked my colleagues is, are we anti-racist or are we not anti-racist? Because if we're anti-racist, we've got a whole pile of stuff that we've got in our own backyard that we need to deal with. And if we're choosing not to deal with the racism in our own family, the Conservative family, why are we choosing to raise the issue of racism in that political party? Because if you are doing that, and you quite rightly should be raising racism wherever you find it, you're not doing it because you're anti-racist, you're doing it because you're weaponizing it. And so this was the concern that I had. And then, if you look at what happened subsequently in the way in which we felt that it was appropriate to have a definition of anti-Semitism, but we didn't want to have a definition of Islamophobia, we put a whole series of measures in place to quite rightly challenge anti-Semitism and fund the work for it, but we didn't do the same when it came to, even though statistically, overwhelmingly the statistics were showing that the community that is at the receiving end of the most amount of hate attacks and the community that's at the receiving end of the most negative polling, which you will be aware of, is the Muslim community. So that's what I talk about in the book, in the way in which it is right we deal with anti-Jewish racism, it is right we deal with anti-Muslim racism, but it is not right that we deal with it simply for political point scoring, which is what was going on with my colleagues when they were dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party.
Absolutely. We probably have time for one more question with some very brief answers from each of you, if that's possible. So, any questions from the audience? Oh, there's one over here, if you don't mind. Is there a mic that we can get? Thank you so much.
One of the major issues is that of poverty, and particularly child poverty. I think one of the observations that was made is that there's an increasing proportion, ethnic minorities make up a disproportionate amount of children and young people in this country, while older people are disproportionately white. Do you think that is part of the explanation of why all the evidence is that removing the two-child limit on child benefit would have the biggest impact upon poverty at the lowest cost, and yet instead we discuss the issue of the winter fuel allowance?
Okay, let me go first quickly. It's not because the older white and more of the young are not. The example of why not is Scotland. Right, the older very white in Scotland, but in Scotland they've decided to give a Scottish child payment, which negates the two-child policy. So the only part of Britain where poverty has fallen is parts of Scotland now, and Scotland, as a country, has a lower child poverty rate than every region of England, including here in the southeast. So you can do it, but it's not that the old white people are inherently nasty. It's that nasty politicians can tell the old white people, we can't afford to do this, and they don't. In Scotland, it's a quiet coalition between the Scottish Labour Party and the SNP not to argue about child poverty, but to actually reduce it. So a family of three, in the bottom 28% in Scotland, under 3 kids under 16, they're getting almost £4,000 a year extra now, untapered. No child in Scotland need go cold or hungry. Quiet agreement between politicians. It's like climate change. When your politicians decide not to argue about something, then you've won. Right? And that's what's happened. That's what we need on racism. Right? It's not allowed. It's racism. We're not going to have any of that. Oh, but you've got to understand them. No, it's bigotry. It's racism. It's not allowed. And the same with issues like child poverty. We can actually afford, not least because we have less and less and less children, to reduce child poverty dramatically. But we are going to desperately need more people coming in, because we're not going to go back to 2.1 kids per couple, like, ever.
I agree actually with Danny. I don't think it's that the older people are white and the younger people, that the younger communities are ethnic minority. I think it's much more cynical than that. I think older people vote and younger people don't. And we know that in the end, if we upset people in that older category, then, you know, at some point they will turn on us. And that's why we certainly within the Conservative Party, when we did make those cuts, I think they landed in places where we thought it wouldn't have an electoral impact on us without actually thinking about the social impact.
Thank you so much. We will have to stop there, I'm afraid, but I just want to thank you both for such a rich and engaging conversation, and thank you for your questions as well. Thank you.